Okay, so I think we're ready to get started. It's 1:46 Eastern time, I guess. Welcome to session 3. It's actually a very nice segue from the previous session because there was quite a bit of discussion towards the end about sharing resources, and this session is really all about community resources. And so Olivier and I will be co-chairing this, and Olivier is going to start off with an overview of the panel and some of the white papers. So I'll turn it over to you, Olivier.
Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so welcome to the community resources session. So I will try to summarize quickly the different 12 papers that we received in this session. So I tried to organize them in 3 teams that are more or less coherent for the different papers that we received. So the first team is on projects for networking courses. Then there are several papers on tools, and then there is a discussion on whether we should do real or virtual labs and how to organize the labs. So first, the projects. We have 2 papers related to projects. The first one by Patrikakis Feidakis from the University of West Attica. They suggest to use mini notes as a way to engage the students and ask them to provide some mini notes on parts of the topic so that they can discuss those mini notes and provide several hints on how to organize the course around these mini notes as projects. And then the second paper is reconfigurable context reactive blended networking and communication courses. And this is by Charan McGoldrick and Meriel Hugart. And so they consider 2 different courses, one undergraduate one, which is I would say a classical networking course, Networking 101, and then a graduate course, which is more related to IoT and cloud. And they propose different projects that they have used in this course that can be reused by other teachers. The next group of papers is on tools for networking courses. And again, we have a variety of tools for different types of networking courses. So the first one by Thomas Anderson and Elise Michael from University of Washington is on the use of model checking for remote instruction. So this is a course which is focused on distributed systems, and the authors, they explain first how they use model checking to be able to verify some of the assignments of the students. And when the students develop a distributed algorithm, they do sometimes mistakes. And with model checking, they are able to catch the errors from the students and provide them feedback. And also, thanks to model checking that can provide a trace, they can explain where the problem is. And then they discuss how the system has been used in several iterations of the course. Next one is called Antidote for COVID-19 Pandemic-Induced Surge in Online Learning by Parag Patil Shriram, Sundaresan Tyagi, and Vedyayan from India. And here they propose a complete system which allows to distribute learning information, which includes Jupyter notebooks, which includes links to different materials like NS3 simulations and course material, which seems to be a pretty interesting system. And would have loved to be able to test it to provide you more information, but maybe the authors are available and they can provide some feedback and some additional comments. But there are lots of details in the paper. Next, we have 2 papers, Resources for Teaching Computer Networking in a Time of COVID and Beyond by Jim Kurose and Keith Rhodes, and Using Tools and Testbed for Teaching and Learning Computer Networking During the Pandemic and Beyond by Michael Zink, from both from UMass as well. And so these 2 papers, they provide different types of material and links to different tools which can be used by professors who are active in teaching networking courses. So the first one provides slides, survey questions, different packet traces, example projects, and things like that. And the others focus more on tools and testbed that can be used to teach the networking classes. And now we have software tools which can be used to design projects and to develop projects for the students. So the first one is SwitchYard, a framework for network system building project by Joël Sommers from Colgate University. So they developed a Python-based framework that allows the students and the teachers to propose projects that the students can do and build step-by-step different systems like an IP router, firewalls, or other systems that need to parse and analyze packets and process packets. Then there is a paper from Maxime Pirot, Ludovic Taffin, and myself on towards a collection of packet trace interactive exercises for computer networking education. So we have developed a system that allows to take libpcap packet traces and then use that to ask questions to the students in two ways. The first way is to ask the students to reorder the packets from the trace by showing them in random order. And the second way is to ask the student to predict the value of some fields, for example, the value of an acknowledgement in a TCP trace and other things like that. And then the main theme for the white papers is labs. Should we go real or virtual labs, and different tools which can be used for virtual labs. So the first paper is past, present, and future of our networking labs. And that's interesting because Georg Lieber, Parviz Kermani, and Magdal Zarki look at the evolution of the labs that they have used in their classes for the last 20 years and try to use that to predict what will happen for the next lab and whether, and there is a discussion on whether we should go virtual and what are the benefits of keeping real labs where the students can play with cables. Then there is a paper by Marc-Oliver Pal on iLab at Homes, where he summarizes the lessons that he learned during while teaching a course in 3 locations in Europe and in Australia that use lab, real and virtual ones, and the problem that the student had while accessing this lab, and provide lots of information about the lab as well. And then there is another tool from Mathieu Jardin, Olivier Tillmans, Maxime Maway, and myself, which describe how you can extend Mininet to be able to create labs that use OSPF routing, RIP routing, BGP routing, and that provide simple Python scripts that allow to create the lab and then pass it to the students. Then Fraida will present her work on using Genie to provide, to teach computer networks. And then I can pass the floor to Fraida so that she can continue and present. Let me see how I can stop sharing.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so then Fraida, it's your turn.
Let me just pull things up. All right, so thank you very much. And so my paper was about some tools for networking labs. And before I get into the details of what I used for my networking labs, I just want to acknowledge that there are many platforms that one could use for networking labs. This is a list, it's not an exhaustive list. We have labs based on packet traces. There are browser-based interactive activities that could be considered a kind of labs. Some of the white papers spoke about a specialized programming language or API that students could use. You can use a network simulator to do simulated labs. Many people are using container-based platforms like Mininet or Core for networking labs. Some white papers spoke about an on-campus computer lab that students could access remotely during a pandemic. And then, of course, I used a testbed, for example, Genie, but there are others such as Cloud Lab and others around the world to offer networking labs to students during a pandemic. So I'm going to tell you in a few minutes why I chose to use Genie and why you might choose to use Genie. But first, some background. So you might have heard about Genie before. You might even have had colleagues who tried using Genie before. You might yourself have used Genie before, or you might never have heard of it, and maybe you'll go Google it right now. So Genie is a research and education platform for computer networking. And many people have tried to use it in various ways to teach computer networks. And if you read about their experiences, it reminds me a little bit of this famous parable of the blind man and the elephant. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's a story about a bunch of blind men, or in this case, blindfolded people, encountering an elephant for the first time. And they each encounter a different part of it, and they come to different conclusions about what it is and how it works. So Genie is very similar in that respect. I think even among this group of white papers presented here, my experiences using Genie have been very different from, for example, the resources that Mike Vink has developed and used. So depending on how you use it, there can be very different experiences. For example, to take the example of teaching Dijkstra's algorithm to computer networking students using Genie, I've done it 3 ways. So one way, the entire back end of this is hosted on Genie, but I've presented it to students as just a browser-based interactive activity, where when they click on these different buttons, for example, the FIU button, the Kansas button, they visit that node in the topology and execute the next step of Dijkstra's algorithm on that node and fill in the table according to that. So that's one way to teach Dijkstra's algorithm on Genie. Another way is have students actually log into hosts on Genie and collect measurements with tools like ping and fill in a table and use that to complete Dijkstra's algorithm. And then there's another way, which is you might have students learn how to set up this topology themselves, to how to set up the different hosts in the topology and configure them, and then use them to learn about Dijkstra's algorithm. So there are many ways of using Genie for networking labs, and depending on your student population and how much time and energy you have, you might choose one or more of these. In NYU in the spring semester, our main use of Genie to teach networking labs during the pandemic was in this course that was actually first introduced in the 90s when I was a very small child, so predates me by a lot. And the course is based on this textbook, TCP/IP Essentials, a lab-based approach by Shiv Panwar and some others. And the textbook includes background material and a complete lab manual for carrying out experiments over a 10-week sequence. And it was designed for an in-house lab, so students come in person, they manipulate the cables to connect hosts to switches and so on, and they each set at a different host and they carry out experiments together. Now, we also have a lab manual online so that you can run every single experiment in this book on the Genie testbed. So when we were teaching this course in the spring 2020 semester, we were able to transition our in-person students to doing the exact same lab they were already doing online in a matter of weeks. Now, for most of you who are looking for community resources, you may not be looking to, do a whole new computer networking course following that textbook. If you're looking for some resources that you can kind of pull into your existing computer networking courses, I also described in my white paper a bunch of lab exercises or demonstrations that can be used on a standalone basis or integrated into an existing course. Now, why would you choose to use one of these or one or more of these versus one of the other platforms I mentioned earlier? What we liked about this for teaching during a pandemic is students don't really have to install and run stuff on their own devices. So unlike some container-based platforms or simulation platforms where students have to install something or maybe run a VM, this is something students only need a browser and an SSH client for. And everything else runs on infrastructure that you don't need to develop and maintain. It's already there. Another thing we like about it is that students might have to learn to use the Linux environment for the first time. So there is a bit of a learning curve to that. But that's a learning curve that's widely useful because students are likely to use that again. And it's also nice that it's built for collaboration, so you can set it up so that students can work together in a shared topology in Genie, and TAs can jump in, log onto students' resources, and assist them with them. And just a few quick tips on how to use them most effectively. The biggest tip is test everything first. So I think anyone who has tried using resources they find online have had this experience where you find something and it looks great, but maybe it hasn't been updated in 3 years and it no longer runs, and you might need to make some changes or ask the authors if they have an updated version. I would also encourage you to record maybe a little video intro that relates the topic to your course and or a video walkthrough. We found that students found those very helpful. I can see from the, let's say, hit numbers that students watch them many, many times. And finally, we have to figure out some ways to support these activities with extra TA support and peer support in order to make them most effective. Thank you.
Are we going to me now?
Yes.
Yep, okay. So thanks. So this session is full of some great papers about a lot of tools and labs and problem sets and so on. And I think the community has a pretty good history of making that sort of stuff available. This is a little bit unique. The paper actually is in the listed among those in the last session tomorrow. But Bruce, Davey, and I had written a textbook and revised it many times over, and it kind of sat dormant for 10 years. And we decided that we didn't want it to die, the copyright to die within a publisher, Elsevier. So we took us a couple of years, but we were able to get the copyright rights from Elsevier. And it kind of happened at a time that I think the textbook industry is at a bit of a crossroads. So in the Elsevier case, we made an argument that the only way they were going to see improvement in the book in another version is if they let us take it into a kind of an open source model. And so they eventually agreed to that. And the idea is that we would get the community to contribute to it. And the paper has some thoughts about that experience, but there were some positives, and you know, it wasn't a huge number of contributions, but I think we figured out some ways that we can start to get more contributions into something like this. So anyway, Elsevier clearly was at a crossroads, and I know Jim's book with Peterson just is actually a year ago. They said they were going into a digital first model. They're clearly trying to rethink how to do their publishing. I don't know if you know of them, but Morgan and Claypool has a subscription-based model. This is Mike Morgan from Morgan Kaufman, who was our original publisher. And what they do is they publish sort of monographs. It's a little bit more focused on graduate level, but not entirely. But they sell subscriptions to university libraries, so you probably have access to their content. I mention them because it's a different model, and we've just started a new series with them on network systems, and we're hoping to model it a little bit after what they have done with the computer architecture community, where it's a big deal that, you know, every year when it gets to ISCA, you try to get your book published, and there's a really good accumulation of material, more at the grad student level, but I think that's where some of this work starts, and then it kind of migrates down the curriculum. But in any case, go check out what they're doing and think about contributing, because there's an opportunity here. But in any case, the textbook industry is at a crossroads. It's not the only piece of collateral that we use in teaching, but it's a pretty important one, or at least historically has been. And Bruce and I were thinking that this is really an opportunity to try to rethink and do something disruptive. Now, it turns out that I'm with an open source organization, the Open Networking Foundation, and we spend all of our time trying to help the network operators disrupt the legacy vendors. And it kind of felt a lot like what we're trying to do in the textbook is disrupt the legacy textbook publishing industry. In any case, it turns out to be, I think, a pretty decent model for a way to think about textbooks as a community effort. So one, what's happening in the industry is there's a lot of emphasis now on open source. And so I think we just generally see that across computing generally. The second thing that's happening is, rather than, you know, large bundled prepackaged solutions that you go get from a vendor or a textbook publisher, you might think about going out and getting all the components you need and then putting them together yourself. And that was kind of the ONF model, kind of on the industry side. What turns out to be the hard problem is, once you've disaggregated everything and built a bunch of microservices, somebody's got to put them back together, and an integration problem is a big one. In any case, this is kind of a model for what we believe to be a reasonable approach to the textbook side. So on the open source software, clearly, if you can get the rights to, or you never give them away in the first place, to your textbook material, you can put it on GitHub, which is what we've done with the systems approach. There are now, if you don't know about Creative Commons, you know, maybe you know the Apache 2.0 license, go to Creative Commons and you will discover a whole lot of really incremental licensing models that you can apply to your material. And there's a bunch of publication tools, so it's easy to self-publish now. And then when you're done, if you want to, you can obviously put it up on Amazon and sell the ebook. Sort of the disaggregation aspect of this is simply, you know, the computer science technique of let's break things down into smaller pieces. I'm calling them microbooks, kind of as a riff on microservices. And we started with an introductory networking textbook, and what we have done since then, in addition to putting that online, is then gone off and spun off some microbooks, which are about chapter length on a narrow topics. 5G and SDN are the first two. And we kind of think of that as a model for how we can generate more content going forward. And the last point here is, while it is perfectly fine, and this happens in the open source software side of the world too, that you just get all comers and everybody's got a bit of open source software. Everybody can obviously put content online, and there's a lot of good textbooks or parts of textbooks that you can find online. Ultimately, you have to make that somehow coherent. And so I've used the word curate because it's something that we have found is a useful technique at ONF, but it's basically saying it's not just a random collection of material, it's architected, or there's a framework. And if you buy into that framework, then you can find all of the open source components, and they all kind of fit together and make sense. Of course, you can also bring editing, a heavy editing hand to it to make it read in a coherent sort of way too, if that's useful. Now, there's lots of different ways to integrate this stuff, and we wouldn't presume that we have the right one. We just have one, and that's kind of the way open source works. You get a project that has an ethos, and people contribute, and there are people that review those commits and decide what gets in and what doesn't. You get comments back, and you basically move things forward that way. In any case, we think this is kind of an interesting model. It happens to dovetail a little bit with what Morgan and Claypool are doing, so we're trying to figure out if it plugs in there. But more information online, and I mean, ultimately what I'd like to see happen and move the community forward is that we start to collect this material and assemble it in various ways. And I'd love to hear how people react to that and think they could contribute. Let me stop sharing.
Okay. Olivier, do you want to say anything more specifically about some of the work you have in here, or do you want to move to discussion? Sorry.
I think we can move to discussion. That's the important part of the workshop, is to move to discussions.
Okay. Well, golly, maybe as a session co-chair here, I can take the prerogative and well, first of all, thank you both for really outstanding presentations. Those are great, and the white papers, this notion of sharing things is great. I had questions I wanted to ask both of you, but I'll only ask one first. Larry, I wanted to say, first of all, that I think what you're doing with the open source is fabulous. And Olivier, I think this was probably 7 or 8 years ago, you started an effort like that, I think more at the graduate level, for an open source textbook as well. As a textbook author, I've been just so shocked at how the computer science textbook publishing industry has been disrupted in the last just 3 or 4 years. And so it's sort of like what happened to music when Napster first came along, that I think everyone in publishing is still, their heads are still spinning saying, what are we going to do? And Larry, I guess I had a question for you, and it had to do with the curation issue. And you said, you need to architect it. So one could say, well, I need structure, for example, but then there's style also, right? So you could say, oh, I'm going to build a house. It has to have a bathroom. It has to have a living room. It has to have a kitchen. But, when you walk into, a kitchen in India, it's different from a bathroom in Belgium. It's different from a living room in the United States. And so how do you, maybe the first question is that kind of coherency within an architecture? I don't know if that's part of an architecture or not, but that kind of coherency, is that something important?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's an experiment, and I don't know how this is going to turn out. What I can say is, people, and this is true in open source, people want to own their contributions. There's a sense of ownership. And it's not just for credit. I mean, it's a more basic than that. And so it really has to be a community thing. So first of all, but the way Bruce and I were approaching it is we had a particular style, and we interacted with individuals who wanted to participate and help us out implementing it. But I think that's not unlike what happens in any edition upgrade. I'm sure you've experienced this. You go ask the guy who knows most about such and such for some help. So at that micro level, I think there is some value in the style. But I think the real thing is sort of popping up from that sentence level style thing. I think there can be multiple architectures. And if we can, I mean, this is sort of standard system stuff. If we can figure out some useful building blocks, then we can build different houses out of those same building blocks, to use that metaphor. And I mean, one of the things that was just so obvious after having let the 5th edition sit for roughly 10 years, I went back and looked at it. It felt like I was reading a historical record. And yeah, maybe students really don't care about historical record. Tell me what way it is today. So that was really one of the big kind of, architecture kinds of shifts. Short answer, it's an experiment. I think you have to have some kind of structure, but there can be more than one answer to that.
Well, I'll ask my second question then. So Fraida, I think you said you were a little girl. I think I was probably a full professor when that book came out, Shiv's book. I wanted to ask you the extent to which you thought those kinds of taking a few of those experiments, that you could fit that into an introductory course. Because when you do, like at UMass, we teach a lab course that's very similar to that, but it's a standalone course, like I think the one that you were talking about. How possible is it to just take 2 or 3 things out of there and teach them in the context, or use those as exercises in the context of a larger introductory course?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll share my screen again real quick. So what you can see here is an example of one lab exercise from that course. So this is a lab exercise on the spanning tree protocol, and that's something that a lot of you are teaching in your introductory computer networking courses. So this is one that can be used pretty easily as a standalone lab exercise, or even as a demonstration in front of the class. I'll just show you what it looks like. There's some background information here, basics about the spanning tree protocol, how it works, and so on, which of course just reminds students hopefully of what you've already taught them. Then it shows you what the results of the experiment should look like. So here's a video that shows a broadcast storm occurring when you try to send one broadcast packet on a system that has a loop and no spanning tree protocol. So it motivates the protocol. And it's actually pretty cool to see. I'm sending just one packet right now, and now you can see thousands of copies of it all over the network. And then there are step-by-step instructions for students to run that. So basically, they can actually run this entire experiment by copying and pasting commands from the instructions into their terminal. It includes explanations of it. And at the end, there are also some exercises, questions you could ask your students to answer or not, or discuss in class. And you can find a lot of activities like this that will work as a kind of standalone or drop-in lab exercise or demonstration in class. I have this blog. If you click on the education tag in the blog, you can see a lot of examples of experiments that are kind of on fundamental topics that are suitable for that kind of use.
Oh, I see. So that's very nice. So in a sense, you don't have to have people, the students sort of program from the bottom up, because I mean, that's when it can take a large amount of effort on their part, but first you teach it and then they can cut and paste and experiment a little bit with it.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the experiments that I've developed for teaching students are the ones that I kind of wanted to try out myself, because to take the example I just showed you, when I learned the spanning tree protocol, I learned that it helps prevent broadcast storms, but I've never seen a broadcast storm, right? So that was something I felt like I personally wanted to try out for myself, and maybe my students would also enjoy trying it out for themselves. So we tried to design some experiments that, could show students things that we might have taught them or shown them, but that they can internalize better by, doing it step by step themselves, but without necessarily having to build it from the ground up.
Okay, great.
So I have a question, if I can jump in, for Olivier about his experience. I know that he has put a lot of textbook material online, and how to keep it moving forward, keep it fresh, get contributions. It's a tricky problem. I'm just wondering what your experience is.
So getting a community around it is still pretty difficult. So I can manage to get support from the PhD students of my group, from the students who follow my classes, but getting contribution from outside remains difficult. So what I learned while doing the open source ebook was that the first thing is that when initially I wrote a PDF file that I distributed to the students, and then I moved to HTML and I added HTML links to all the papers in the bibliography and all the RFCs. And I was pretty surprised later at the exam that the students had read some of the papers and some of the RFCs. And this was pretty positive for me because in the past, students never went to the library to read the papers that were mentioned in the textbook. At least that was my experience when I was a student. And so it was surprising to see that just having hyperlinks allowed the students to get access. And then what I do is that I encourage the students who follow my classes to provide contributions to the GitHub, even correcting some typos. And when they do significant contributions, then they get some bonus for the courses. And even a small bonus, and usually these are the good students, so they don't need the bonus anyway. And then from time to time, we do a project on improving some part of the exercise, on adding something. So, and there are a few examples in the workshop this year.
Good, good. Yeah, I've had pretty good. GitHub is a great place for people to give you bug fixes. So that's been where we've gotten most of our contributions. But when it's been, do you want to co-author something, then you need to go solicit that and draw people in that way. And that I think is kind of the value, a little bit of the microbook idea from my point of view. It's a little bit of a standalone project, and now you are a first order contributor to it. You're a co-author on it, and that was one reason why I think breaking things down into smaller pieces was a little bit helpful.
Yeah, I think it gets to that ownership issue and the coherency, because you can take a 90-page chapter on 5G or multimedia or whatever it's going to be, and it'll have coherency internally, and it's not writing a 1,000-page book.
Oh, so it's right. So the lowered bar is a huge thing. You know, at ONF, it's an open source organization, and we spend a lot of time talking about community. You can't just expect the community is going to come along. You have to put effort into it. We have hired community people whose job it is to engage and reinforce and support the community. So I think that.
Actually, maybe I could get you to comment on that. Because I think MiniNet, ONF was central to the initial development of MiniNet, and that required a lot of support and also promotion. And when you were doing Planet Lab for that, I remember you would do sort of activities at SIGCOMM to bring the community together. So maybe if you or Fraida, and then I have a question from Fraida that came up on Slack, sort of comment on how to build community around a resource.
Yeah, there's no simple answer, but yeah, it has to be at the front of your mind that how to build community. And again, ownership. I mean, there is in the open source community, there is kind of an understood credit for having done work. You move up on the rankings of contributors, and so there depends on what gets valued. In academia, you get value for publication. So take the microbook example. In the architecture community, they are getting credit for having contributed a chapter's worth of material. I'm calling it a chapter microbook on some topic. And I don't know exactly how it's weighted tenure, but it's viewed as a valid academic contribution. So if we could replicate what they've done, we would be moving way ahead.
Yeah, that's what we did with the SIGCOMM ebook a few years ago with Ahmed Haddadi. So there is an ebook with 12 different chapters on different topics that can be useful for, let's say, graduate classes where you can select some of the chapters. And yeah, that's something that we could redo if there is a demand within the community. It's not that difficult to organize.
I think that's a really good question about developing community. And with respect to lab exercises specifically, I think there's a real need in the networking education community for some kind of website where people can contribute resources and others can offer feedback on them, or say, hey, I ran this in my spring class and it worked really well, and here's what I did to make it even better. I think that's something that's really missing, because there are so many resources out there, and there's a lot of work involved in even just trying them out, seeing what works, and there isn't really a good way to share your feedback when you do that. I get emails from instructors who have tried my resources and they tell me what worked for them and what didn't, and they contribute corrections and I update them, but there has to be a better way.
Right. And so Fraida, also I think the Genie community, for instance, there's been a Genie education workshop, and so just like like Larry was mentioning, I think the Genie community has made an effort to try to promote building educational resources on top of Genie as well.
Yeah,
although
absolutely.
I'm not sure there's that central site you were just talking about.
Right. Well, so within the Genie community, there have been, a lot of activities like that. So there was this GREE workshops, the Genie Research and Education something workshop. There used to be Genie conferences, Genie engineering conferences multiple times per year that had education meetings. There used to be webinars and things like that. But of course, when the money goes, a lot of the activities that go along with it also go. So obviously that activity is at a much lower level now. There is the Genie Group's mailing list, which gets some discussion about that, but it's not the same. And of course, not everybody wants to use Genie. Not everyone wants to use only Genie. So it would be really nice if there was some kind of shared resource that covered all different kinds of lab platforms.
Okay, so I agree with that 10,000%. And in the sidebar chat, I gave Olivier and Matt a heads up on this question that's coming. So they've both been, the SIGCOMM education chairs, I guess. And Olivier started that kind of central site before, and I think Matt has great interest in doing that. But maybe I'd ask them, whether they think SIGCOMM EDU, which is the sponsor of this workshop, has a role there. Or maybe that's a leading question, I don't know.
Let me try to answer with something that failed. And then I guess maybe Matt will have a better solution. So what we tried a few years ago when I became SIGCOMM Education Director was to have a wiki where people could post information about the material available or the resources available. And it turned out that it was pretty difficult to maintain that. So we got some submission in the beginning, but then everybody forgot. So I don't think that's the right model to do that. So having something very broad which can support everything, maybe it's not the good model. Maybe we should focus on something like Networking 101, and then provide some material that would be related to Networking 101, and maybe have a kind of a team that would every year or every 2 years provide a set of tools or a set of material that could be suitable for Networking 101. And then once we get that ready, then we can move to another more advanced course or something like that. So if we could focus on activity on something which is manageable and which can be published, say, every 2 years in CCR with an update, because we need to maintain the resources, and that's the most difficult part. So if we select a few resources, this is fine, but then we have to be sure that 2 years later, the resources are still available and still usable. They have been upgraded to support the new software or whatever. And this is the difficult part.
So I think what you described would be really useful. So to have a set of reference activities that were known to work. But I think, in addition to that, it would also be really useful to have a much more open place where anyone could contribute. Things wouldn't necessarily be verified to work, but maybe other educators could comment and indicate when they've tried things and when they've worked. For example, you know, if I post something on the site and then somebody tries it and it doesn't work, they could post a comment, and then maybe I might follow up with that comment and say that I've updated it. And then other people coming across it in the future could see those interactions.
Yeah, maybe the Slack can be used for that, or CCR can be used for that. Steve mentioned that CCR Online could be used for that, to discuss the links. My experience with CCR Online, which are the comments that you can attach to CCR papers, is that this is 99.9% of spam. And in my 4 years as an editor of CCR, I got one valid comment.
Yeah, maybe I could share my screen again and show something real quick. So in the Genie community, we've had a site like this, for example, that lists a bunch of Genie-based classroom exercises. And you can see they're organized in different topics. So, you know, networking basics, advanced stuff, distributed, wireless, stuff like that. And each person who contributes a resource contributes a link, a brief description, the level, how many resources are required, and sometimes contact information if somebody wants to ask a question about it or offer feedback. Now, I would really love to see something exactly like this, but not exclusively for Genie exercises. So maybe also include, you know, core exercises, mini-net exercises, packet trace exercises. And I'd also like to see that, you know, maybe when I click on this, it just takes me to a page where there's a comment section for that. So maybe if somebody tries this out, they can then leave a comment behind describing how their experience was. So this is something I personally would definitely use a lot. I don't know if I'm the only one, but I think it's something that's really lacking in the community.
So I wanted to add something on top of that, Fraida. You know, you mentioned things that work, and I think you usually, a lot of times people mean things that compile, but you know, we have an art to teaching also, right? And so there are things that work when you try to teach and things that work when you don't. And so, you know, one of the things I think we've seen in the first two sessions here, for example, is that when you're teaching at a distance, what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, Keith Ross and I had been talking about this issue about, well, you know, is there, how do you bring active learning into teaching networking 101? So in addition to resources like, here's a lab resource that you can run this lab, I think resources in terms of teaching practices. In computer science, there's a group of people, I think they're mostly in, you know, the discrete math or discrete structures, who have nifty problems, right? And so they share teaching tips and interesting problems among themselves. So it's another thing one could share.
Yeah, exactly. I love nifty assignments, and I've always wished that we could have that for networking.
Yeah. So Matt, did you want to, sorry if I cut you off.
Yeah, this discussion is really helpful. I've been talking with some folks on whether it's possible to create some sort of resource page. A few other thoughts that have come up are, or I guess these are questions, are, you know, would we want a ranking system on there? One person mentioned that if we have some sort of thing with all these links, how do we know which ones to use? Can we do like thumbs up, thumbs down? One suggestion that was proposed is to do a Reddit, which is like a site where you can kind of post links and kind of vote them up and down. Other things that were mentioned are about curation, like how do we, or should we do any sort of curation on the content, or you know, is somebody going to like actively post you know, summaries about information? That was kind of one thing someone mentioned is, you know, can we kind of have links to different resources, but, you know, maybe some explanation along with them to kind of describe, you know, when they're used and how they're used and things like that. Let's see, on the Slack just now, somebody mentioned using GitHub as an option. That's an interesting idea too. So I guess one question, there's kind of these different platforms. Maybe we can kind of think about like what we want, what kind of structure we want to impose and how to kind of fit all this together.
So yeah, SIGCOMM has a GitHub organization. There's one repo there now. Rule number one is use the common tool, and this is the common tool. So I think there's an opportunity, there's room for both curated and not curated. If you look at organizations, let's take Apache, for example, there is a blessing threshold you get across your incubation, and then you have to demonstrate you have enough value to enough different people that then it gets promoted to a first-class project. So there are pretty well-established ways of tiering this and doing this.
Yeah, I really like the idea of having maybe in addition to a curated type of repository, but also having that Reddit type of thing where people could just upvote things that are useful and people could comment in a kind of free-form way, because the lower the barrier to entry for, submitting a resource or commenting on a resource, the better.
Well, since there's a pause, let me throw out another small related topic, which is copyright. And this is a huge deal in the textbook side, so that's why it's always in the front of my mind. I've been pitching this microbook thing with Morgan and Claypool, and they are a publisher and they have a revenue generating model, but they have been completely open to simultaneously keeping the books submitted to them that they publish available on the web so that anyone can get to them. I think they recognize that it's going to find its way onto the web one way or another, so that it's kind of under the author's control is okay with them. But I think that kind of hybrid model is a good one, that there are Creative Commons has licenses, variations of their licenses that make this all doable. So there's a lot of opportunity to simultaneously go through a publisher and bring their value add and make it, open source from it's on GitHub and anyone can contribute, and B, open source in that there's an online version that you can get to without going through a paywall.
And Apache, and Morgan Claypool does that for individual works. What about this issue? Would Morgan Claypool, for instance, if there was going to be something for Networking 101 and something for Networking Labs and something for wireless, do they look at that as a whole, like Apache might, and say, oh, okay, we have lots of different resources in each of those, or do they put their bet in one place? I
don't know. I do know that they did at one point, they were publishing ACM's online books. And I don't know how, I don't know the whole story there, but they have, so I don't know that they would be the place to organize, but it could be SIGCOMM, or it could be an outside organization that goes to them with a plan. That's how I would probably approach it. But I think that's entirely doable. And that's kind of the way that we have started it, that there's content that I don't know that they would publish because it's not really, they're kind of a little bit more on the graduate side and advanced side, but there's a perfectly good set of modules out there on some of the more undergrad fundamentals as well.
Well, I guess something that I definitely took from Olivier, and I remember when he started that back in 2011 or whatever, this notion that you need sort of, I don't know, active curation and a contributing community, and you need to sort of build that community up, that you can't just put it out there and say, okay, please contribute, because as he said, the number of sort of useful things that came in where there's not as much weed among the chaff.
Yeah, that's the key. I mean, something that's worked for me, but this is now personal, it's not scalable and globally applicable, is that I enjoy co-authoring with people, because I get to work on a topic I might not be the expert at, and I learn a lot, and I sort of transcribe it into my way of presenting it, and then it kind of works for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't scale.
Okay, I haven't been checking. Are there any more comments that have come in on Slack? Plus for doing things on GitHub?
While you're looking at that, I just kind of have a comment about curating resources. So I just want to make the point that the resources that are most effective for one instructor are not going to be anything like the ones that are most effective for another instructor. So I don't see any reason why, you know, we need kind of some set of authoritative resources for a computer networking class. The resources that we use for lab activities in NYU are not going to look anything like, you know, the resources that are going to be used down the block at City Tech. It's just not. It's a very different student body. We have different resources in terms of instructors and TAs. So
Yeah.
I just really want to make sure that whatever kind of community resources we develop, it should be kind of inclusive of the different kinds of schools and the different kinds of classes that might make use of them.
I think that's a really great point. And you remember when Anand was speaking in the previous session, he sort of laid out, okay, you know, there are all these different types of schools with different types of students. And I think in Edmundo's talk in the previous session, he talked about having sort of multiple resources there so that teachers could pull material that they thought would be best for their students. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, even as a textbook author, one size does not fit all, right? I mean, in the end, it's all about how you personalize the content for the students who are in your class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's important to disseminate the information. So having the workshop with all the papers is one step in this direction. But we also have the education column in CCR, where I would encourage anyone who has something to contribute to the community to submit the paper and to describe what they have done. And so at least it gets some visibility in the community. Otherwise, we have some really good material or some really good software or some really good labs that are used somewhere that could be reused in multiple universities, but nobody knows that this exists.
Yeah, so Olivier, I agree with that 100%, and I'm taken with what Larry said before and sort of what he's demonstrated over the years of sort of actively going out and promoting. So sort of having those vehicles alone isn't enough, right? That somehow you have to go out and, I don't know, go into push mode a little bit, or, you know, push with your hands open so people can come with questions or something.
Well, incentives are huge. And if we give credit for it, then people would do it. In different environments, there is credit. Now, you know, open source software is not that pure thing that you might think it is. A lot of the contributions come because it's your job. You work for company X and your job is to contribute. Yeah, but you need incentives.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to the idea of submitting to CCR, for example, so suppose that as an instructor, I have this idea for one lab exercise I want to offer in my class, and I just put together this one exercise, right? Maybe it's not worthy of a paper, right? What should I do with that? How can I share it with the broader community?
Matt?
Sorry, did you hear me?
So Steve Uhlig is online. And
Write
he
a
says,
short editorial. So that's what
write
I
a
mean
short
by,
editorial, yeah.
that's what I mean to barrier to entry. I'll be honest, right? There is a pandemic going on. I'm at home. I don't have the normal daycare that I normally have during the year. I'm teaching online, which is a lot more work than usual. I have a larger course load than usual for teaching. I'm supposed to be doing research also and supervising research students. The likelihood of my writing a short editorial about one lab assignment is extremely low. I mean, even submitting to this workshop was a kind of thing where I just kind of barely got it in under the wire. It's really hard to justify, you know, taking resources away from the other activities I'm supposed to be doing to, you know, write an editorial about something like this. What if I just want to say like, hey, here's this cool thing I did. Go, you know, go look at it and use it if you like it.
So I guess I'd actually like to comment on that. So Steve said, first of all, on the Slack channel that they can be very short, right? And Larry said you need incentives, right? And so the question to your, you know, how do you spend your precious, you know, given all the things you can do with your life and things you have to do, how is it that you sort of find time to do that? And it does come down to incentives, right? And sometimes it's just a personal thing because you want your stuff out there and you'd like to see people using it. I mean, I think that's why people do a lot of things. And then there's, you know, are there incentives within your department and university where you actually get credit for doing those kinds of things? So Larry mentioned earlier the architecture community where these contributions for these mini chapters have risen to a level that if you've written one, I don't know, might show up in your annual report or your promotion case or something like that, because people take a look at it. So I think thinking about the incentives, both personal and then probably, you know, just the personal satisfaction you get from seeing people use your stuff, but then there may be something within your department.
Yeah, and you've got to convince your department, your university that this is valuable, and you do that. That's because it's valuable within the community. So like I mentioned with architecture, their incentive is to get it submitted, their manuscript submitted X months ahead of ISCA, so they can show up at ISCA, which is their big conference, their SIGCOMM, with their publication, and it's the community recognizes it.
So on Slack, there is a discussion on whether Slack is a nice way to disseminate this kind of information. Maybe something that I could suggest is that a few months ago, there was an editorial from Alberto Denotti and others on hyperpapers in CCR. And the idea was to suggest a topic on which multiple people could work, and then the research could lead to a future paper. This did not materialize for research paper, but it could be an idea for labs or for tools or for anything related to education. So if you have an idea on something that you are doing and that you would like to share with others, you could propose it to Slack and then try to find other people with whom we could collaborate and to write something more concrete and something stronger to submit to CCR. As Larry mentioned, the fact that you can collaborate with others is also an incentive. So if you announce on Slack that you would like to do, I don't know, a lab on P4, then you might find other people who are interested in building labs on P4 with you. And if you are working at 3, 4, 5 people, then it's getting much more interesting than being alone in your university on building your lab, because you know that you will get feedback from others. Mm-hmm. So Slack could be a way to start this kind of discussion as well. So find collaborators who have the same problem as you or a problem which is close to yours, and with whom you could discuss, and then you can build something together.
Well, speaking of building something together, when Matt and I were talking a few days ago in advance of the workshop about what might happen in BOFs, he suggested that, you know, a good idea for 1 or 2 BOFs would be people who would like to almost edit in real time a Google Doc on a particular topic. So synthesizing some, okay, well, here are best practices for dealing with this, or here's a set of resources for doing that. And it gives you the opportunity to collaborate, and also, I mean, then it's owned by the group. So I think those are both great things. So maybe, I don't know, Matt, maybe we'll try to twist an arm or hopefully somebody would be interested in sort of just chairing one of the BOFs tomorrow on that. Okay. Well, we're at our anointed ending time here. So I guess from both Olivier and myself as co-chairs here, thanks for a great discussion again, and thanks to all the white paper authors. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, this was a session about people who built things and want to share things with the community, and each of the white papers have some really good ideas there. And some of them will actually pick up, I think, tomorrow in the teaching section as well. So thank you to the panelists. And Matt, I don't know, this wraps up the end of day 1. Any thoughts or comments?
I don't think so. Yeah, the discussion on Slack is pretty helpful to kind of reason through things. We'll probably stay on Slack for a while and kind of watch what you guys have to say. But yeah, I think that's it.
Okay. Right, so we're gonna, the Slack channel is gonna remain open long past the end of this workshop, but I think Matt and I, and hopefully others, if you have things you want to discuss and continue posting things, the Slack channel is going to be up and we're going to be actively monitoring and contributing. And there's a rebroadcast. If today was so good, you just want to hear it again, you can tune in another 8 hours and see a rebroadcast of this. There are a number of people in other time zones, sort of, you know, on the other side of the world from here, who indicated they wanted to primarily attend that. So there will be a rebroadcast, and each section sort of followed with an open discussion also, and they'll have access to the Slack as well. We wanted to do this because this is so global, and because, you know, there's only 24 hours in a day and people have to sleep. So we'll reconvene live tomorrow at 8:00 a.m. PDT like we did today. Slack channel's open always, and tune into the rebroadcast or even the discussion if you'd like later this evening. So I think with that, sound good, Matt? I think we're pretty much done for the day. Thank you all. Thank you all for all that participation on the Slack channel also. It's been really, really great. Okay, see you tomorrow morning live.